I've always heard people say life can change in an instant, but until that moment, I never truly understood it. One day, you're sitting across from your wife, Daniel Wilson, her world, her best friend, her partner in every sense of the word. We were planning a vacation, an anniversary trip to Italy. A cliché? Maybe, but we didn't care. We were happy, laughing over the menu as we debated whether Florence or Venice should be our first stop. The next day, I was in a car crash. No warning. No flashing lights or moments of clarity where your life flashes before your eyes. Just the loudest, most sickening sound I've ever heard, followed by silence. I didn't feel the pain right away. That came later. It's strange, isn't it? I thought about Lydia even before I thought about myself. Was she okay? Where was she? My voice didn't work when I tried to call her name, and before I could piece anything together, everything went black. I woke up, if you could call it waking up, somewhere else entirely. Floating, weightless. A part of me wanted to stay in that in-between, where there was no pain, no chaos, no broken glass or shattered metal. But something tethered me to the world I had left behind. Her. Lydia. I wish I could have told her what I saw, what I felt. If I could have held her just one more time, I'd have said so many things. Not just the usual I love you, or I'll miss you. No, it would have been the things that felt too mundane to matter before. Thank you for leaving coffee on the counter even though you don't drink it yourself. Thank you for reminding me to eat lunch when I get busy with work. Thank you for picking up my socks even though it drives you crazy. Thank you for being you. But I didn't get that chance. Lydia didn't get a chance to say goodbye, either. Instead, she got a phone call. A simple, sterile voice informing her that her husband hadn't made it. Not the kind of story you see in movies where there's drama or heartfelt closure. No, it was just a Tuesday morning, and everything she knew was ripped away in a few sentences. The funeral. I wasn't there. Not really, but I felt it. The ache of it. Lydia wasn't the type to cry openly, but she did that day. Silent tears that spilled onto her cheeks as she gripped her father's arm for support. I wanted to scream, to hold her and tell her that I was still with her in some way, that I hadn't left her completely, but instead, I could only watch. Her parents tried. They did. George, her father, stepped in to handle the logistics, funeral homes, cremation options, paperwork. He told her to focus on herself, but Lydia had no idea how to do that. Her life had been me. Our plans, our jokes, our endless debates about whether a dog or cat would make the better pet. She had given so much of herself to our life together that when I was gone, it was like she didn't know who she was anymore. And then there was the support group. That circle of strangers became her lifeline, though she'd never admit it. She sat there every Tuesday evening, listening, occasionally speaking when the weight of silence was too heavy. I remember one night in particular. Sometimes I wake up and forget he's gone, she whispered, and Maria, one of the other widows, reached out to squeeze her hand. That's normal, Maria said, her voice kind but firm. Grief comes in waves. Some days, you'll feel like you're drowning. Other days, you'll be able to swim. Lydia didn't feel like she was swimming, though. Not yet. She kept moving because stopping felt impossible. She went back to work, though only part-time. She clung to routines like a lifeline, even though they were now empty shadows of what they once were. And me? I was there, somewhere in the background, watching, feeling the weight of her grief like it was my own, wishing I could help her carry it, wishing I could tell her that it wasn't her fault, that none of this was her fault. But I couldn't. All I could do was wait. Wait for her to find her footing. Wait for her to see that she was so much stronger than she realized. Wait for her to realize that this wasn't the end of her story, even if it was the end of ours. You'd think death might change some things. That when someone loses everything, the people around them might step up, be kinder, more selfless. In some ways it did. For a while. Lydia's parents, George and Margaret, took over like generals organizing a campaign after I died. They were meticulous, efficient. They held her when she cried, cooked her meals, and reminded her to eat. Lydia told herself that maybe, just maybe, this tragedy had mended the broken parts of their relationship. You see, Lydia never felt like she was her parents' priority. Her younger sister, Celia, had always been the golden child. While Lydia worked hard for every ounce of praise, Celia commanded it with ease. If Celia so much as sneezed, Margaret was there with soup and a warm blanket. Meanwhile, Lydia could win awards, excel at work, or earn accolades, and her efforts were acknowledged with a distracted "good job." But after my death, things shifted. Lydia's parents leaned on her as much as she leaned on them. George asked her about her work, genuinely interested for once. Margaret hugged her more in those months than in the rest of Lydia's life combined. And those family dinners? For the first time, Lydia felt like she was part of something instead of a reluctant spectator. And then Celia came back. Celia didn't just arrive. She arrived. 7 months pregnant, glowing, and commanding the room as if she were royalty. She had been living across town, renting an apartment and keeping to herself, but her reappearance changed everything. "Celia, sweetie, sit here," Margaret fussed, practically shoving Lydia aside to make room at the table. "Do you need a pillow? Are your feet swollen? Let me get you some tea." Lydia watched in silence as her mother hovered over Celia, their parents hanging on her every word. The familiar ache of being second best settled in Lydia's chest, but she tried to push it down. "She's pregnant," Lydia told herself. "It's a big deal. It's normal for them to fuss." But the old wounds reopened quickly. During dinner, Lydia asked the obvious question. "So, who's the father? Have you told him about the baby?" Celia's smile faltered, her fork pausing mid-air. "That's my business," she snapped, her tone sharper than a knife. Margaret jumped in immediately, her voice a shield. "Lydia, don't pry. Celia doesn't have to explain herself to anyone." The hypocrisy hit Lydia like a slap. When we were struggling with fertility treatments, Margaret and George had interrogated her relentlessly, demanding updates, offering unsolicited advice, and asking deeply personal questions. Yet here was Celia, shielded from the same scrutiny. Lydia tried to let it go, but it became harder with each passing dinner. Celia moved in with their parents, and the house became a shrine to her pregnancy. Every conversation revolved around baby names, ultrasounds, and prenatal vitamins. Lydia could barely get a word in before the spotlight shifted back to Celia. But it wasn't just the attention Celia received that made Lydia uneasy. It was the way Celia talked about her future. "How are you planning to manage on your own?" Lydia asked during another dinner, her voice calm but curious. Celia waved her hand dismissively, her trademark smirk playing on her lips. "Don't worry about me. I've got it all figured out." That smirk. Lydia had seen it too many times before, always when Celia was hiding something. The organic smoothie business that tanked in 2 weeks. The life coaching certification she never finished. The cryptocurrency investment that drained her savings. But this time, Celia's confidence felt different, more calculated. "This time, everything's going to work out," Celia said, patting her belly with an air of certainty that should have set off alarms. George beamed at her, pride practically radiating from him. "That's my girl. Always landing on her feet." Lydia forced herself to take another bite of pot roast, swallowing both the food and the bitterness rising in her throat. She had been the one supporting their parents financially for months. Yet here they were, celebrating Celia like she had solved world hunger. Some things never change, Lydia thought, watching her parents hang on Celia's every word. What Lydia didn't know, what none of them had revealed yet, was that Celia's smile wasn't just hiding a secret. It was hiding the storm that was about to upend everything Lydia thought she knew about her family, her marriage, and her life. For now, Lydia stayed quiet, unaware that the foundation beneath her feet was already beginning to crack. You'd think a baby shower would be a safe space, wouldn't you? A pastel-colored celebration of new beginnings and shared joy. Lydia thought so too, or at least she convinced herself of it when she arrived at her parents' house that Saturday morning. She carried 2 carefully chosen gifts, a high-end baby monitor and a handmade blanket she'd spent weeks knitting. The house looked like a Pinterest board brought to life. Pink and blue balloons, streamers draped across every surface, and a diaper cake centerpiece that must have taken hours to assemble. Celia had outdone herself, as usual. She was the kind of person who could turn even a baby shower into an event worthy of a magazine spread. The room was packed with guests. Margaret's bridge club, George's golfing buddies, Aunt Joan and her nosy daughters, and Celia's old college roommates, who clustered around the punch bowl, giggling over some inside joke. Lydia felt out of place, like an accessory that didn't quite fit with the decor. "Time for games," Celia announced, sweeping into the room in a flowing maternity dress that probably cost more than Lydia's monthly rent. She was glowing, the picture of maternal radiance. But there was something in her smile that didn't sit right with Lydia, a sharpness lurking beneath the surface. The games began, measuring Celia's belly with string, guessing the baby's birth date, even the melted chocolate in a diaper game, which Lydia found more disgusting than entertaining. She tried to engage, laughing politely when appropriate, but her unease grew with every passing moment. Celia kept glancing her way, holding her gaze just a beat too long. It was unsettling. Then came the gift opening. Celia made a show of unwrapping each present, cooing over tiny onesies and baby gadgets with theatrical enthusiasm. When she reached Lydia's gifts, her smile faltered for just a second. She held up the blanket, running her fingers over the intricate pattern. "This is beautiful," she said, her tone almost begrudging. Lydia felt a flicker of satisfaction but brushed it aside. This wasn't a competition, or at least, it shouldn't have been. Then Celia clinked her glass for attention. The room fell silent, and Lydia's heart started racing for reasons she couldn't explain. The air felt thick, like a storm was about to break. "I want to thank everyone for coming today," Celia began, one hand resting on her belly. "This baby is a blessing, and I'm so grateful to have such a wonderful support system." Her eyes found Lydia's, and they stayed there. "But there's something else I need to share. Something I think it's time everyone knew." The knot in Lydia's stomach tightened. She gripped the armrest of her chair, bracing herself for what? She didn't know, but she could feel the weight of it coming. Celia's smile turned razor-sharp, her voice ringing out with unnerving clarity. "The father of my baby," she said, pausing for dramatic effect, "is Daniel Wilson, Lydia's late husband." The world tilted. Lydia heard the gasps, the murmurs, the shocked whispers rippling through the room, but they felt distant, muffled, like she was underwater. Celia wasn't done. "As Daniel's baby is his only heir, I'm entitled to half of everything he left. The house, the apartment, the money. My child deserves their father's inheritance." Lydia stared at her sister, uncomprehending. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. "You're lying," Lydia finally managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, no," Celia said, her smile turning cruel. She pulled out her phone and held it up for the room to see. "Then how do you explain these?" Lydia's world shattered all over again. The photos were unmistakable, Daniel and Celia, wrapped in each other's arms, kissing in what looked like a hotel room. Another showed them holding hands at a restaurant Lydia didn't recognize. "He loved me," Celia declared, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "He was planning to leave you for me. We were going to tell everyone, but," she trailed off, her eyes filling with crocodile tears. Then the accident happened. The room buzzed with shocked whispers, but what hit Lydia hardest was the expression on her parents' faces. Not surprise, not disbelief, just a resigned sadness that told her everything she needed to know. They had known. They had known. Margaret and George stepped forward, flanking Celia like bodyguards. "Lydia," George said, his voice stern, "you need to do the right thing here. Your nephew deserves his father's legacy." Lydia felt the room spinning, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She stood on shaky legs, grabbing her purse and pushing past the stunned crowd. Someone, Margaret, maybe, called after her, but she didn't stop. She stumbled into her car, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. The drive home was a blur, her mind replaying those photos, those words. "He loved me. He was planning to leave you." By the time Lydia reached her front door, the reality of it all hit her. Her husband, her sister, her parents, they had all betrayed her in the most unimaginable way, and now, she was left to pick up the pieces of a life she no longer recognized. If betrayal had a weight, Lydia felt it pressing on her chest every second of the day after that baby shower. She didn't know which was worse, the revelation about Daniel's affair with her sister, Celia, or the cold, casual betrayal of her parents. They'd stood there, supporting Celia, demanding Lydia do the right thing, as if she were the one who had wronged them. It was almost unbearable. The photos Celia showed at the shower weren't just burned into Lydia's memory, they haunted her. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw them again. Daniel's smile, the same one he had once reserved for her, now directed at Celia. She saw them holding hands, their stolen moments frozen in time. She hated herself for it, but she opened her phone that night, scrolling back through her old pictures with Daniel, looking for clues she had missed. Had he seemed distant in this photo? Was that smile just for show? And then, the messages started. Celia didn't waste time after the shower. Her text began pouring in the next morning. Lydia, we need to discuss the inheritance. My son deserves what's rightfully his. It's what Daniel would have wanted. Lydia didn't respond. She couldn't. Her hands would shake every time a message popped up, her stomach twisting into knots. But Celia was relentless. Screenshots of conversations between her and Daniel followed. I don't love her anymore. You're the only one I want to be with. We'll tell her after the divorce. The timestamps on the messages gutted Lydia. These weren't just fleeting moments of weakness. They stretched across months, during the same time Lydia had been enduring fertility treatments, blaming herself for why she and Daniel couldn't conceive. Her parents weren't any better. George called the next morning, his tone businesslike and almost dismissive. Lydia, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. You know Celia's child deserves his share of the inheritance. When Lydia didn't respond, Margaret chimed in. Dear, you have to understand. This is about family. About doing the right thing. Celia is struggling, and the baby needs a secure future. Struggling? Lydia repeated, her voice shaking. She had an affair with my husband, lied to my face, and you expect me to hand over everything Daniel left me? We're not taking sides, Margaret insisted, but her tone gave her away. We just want what's fair. Lydia hung up. She didn't trust herself to speak another word without screaming. She spent the next few days in a fog, ignoring the buzzing of her phone as Celia and her parents tried to wear her down. It wasn't until the court summons arrived that Lydia realized just how far her sister was willing to go. The thick manila envelope arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier. Lydia's hands trembled as she opened it, already dreading what she'd find. Her fears were confirmed. Celia was suing her for half of Daniel's estate, claiming it on behalf of her unborn child. The legal language was cold and precise. Celia wanted the house, half of the money, partial ownership of the downtown apartment. She even listed specific furniture items she believed belonged to Daniel and, by extension, her unborn son. Lydia stared at the papers, her vision blurring with tears. She felt like a stranger in her own life. How had it come to this? How had the people she once trusted turned into adversaries? Her first instinct was to fight. She called a lawyer, a man named Richard Dempsey who specialized in inheritance cases. His calm, professional demeanor steadied her nerves as he reviewed the documents. But his words hit her like a punch to the gut. Miss Parker, he began, carefully avoiding her gaze. Your sister has compelling evidence. The text messages, photos, and witness statements, especially from your parents, paint a strong picture of a long-term relationship between Daniel and Celia. Lydia felt the air leave her lungs. So, what does that mean? In cases like this, Richard continued, the court often leans toward sympathy for the biological child. If Celia's baby is proven to be Daniel's, she could have a strong claim to a portion of his estate. Lydia's mind raced. Biological child. Paternity. Proof. The words circled in her head. A storm she couldn't calm. The thought of Daniel and Celia planning a future behind her back was painful enough. But the idea of losing everything he had left her to the sister who betrayed her, it was unbearable. And then there was the guilt. Lydia didn't want to admit it, but a small, spiteful part of her thought, why should I fight for anything Daniel left me? He betrayed me, too. Maybe he doesn't deserve my loyalty. But that thought only made her feel worse. That night, she sat in her living room, surrounded by the remnants of the life she had built with Daniel. Their wedding photo on the mantel, the vase they had picked out on a whim during a weekend trip to the mountains, All of it felt tainted now, like someone had splashed black paint over her memories. The messages from Celia kept coming, each one more demanding than the last. You know this is the right thing to do, Lydia. Just sign the papers. Let's keep this civil. Civil. The word made Lydia laugh bitterly. There was nothing civil about this. As the days passed, Lydia began to steel herself. She didn't know how, but she would fight. For her dignity, for her peace of mind, for the life Daniel had promised her before everything fell apart. She couldn't let Celia and her parents take everything, not without a fight. Lydia didn't know how much more she could take. The lawsuit, the betrayal, the memories of Daniel. It all felt like a crushing weight on her chest, one she couldn't lift no matter how hard she tried. The house that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a prison. Every photo, every piece of furniture reminded her of what she had lost, and what had been taken from her. The calls and texts from her parents and Celia became a relentless assault. She had blocked their numbers, but they found ways to reach her through mutual friends, distant relatives, and even anonymous emails. The pressure was suffocating. So, when the phone rang that evening, showing an unfamiliar number, Lydia almost didn't answer. But something made her pick up. "Hello?" she said, her voice weary. "Is this Lydia Parker?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes. Who's this?" "This is Rebecca Monroe, Daniel's mother." Lydia froze, the phone nearly slipping from her hand. "That's impossible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel told me his parents died when he was young. He said he grew up in foster care." Rebecca's laugh was bitter. "Another lie. I'm afraid. I'm very much alive, Lydia, and I need to talk to you. There are things you need to know about Daniel, things that might help you." Lydia didn't know what to say. She felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet all over again. "Why are you reaching out now?" she managed to ask, suspicion creeping into her voice. "Because I've heard about your sister's lawsuit," Rebecca said, "and because I can't let my son's lies ruin another woman's life. Will you meet me? Please. It's important." Against her better judgment, Lydia agreed. They arranged to meet at a small cafe downtown the next morning. She barely slept that night, her mind racing with questions. Who was Rebecca Monroe? Why had Daniel lied about her? And what could she possibly have to say that would help? When Lydia arrived at the cafe, Rebecca was already there, sitting at a corner table. Lydia recognized her instantly. The resemblance to Daniel was uncanny. The same sharp features, the same piercing blue eyes. She even carried herself with the same quiet confidence Lydia had always admired in her husband. "I was at the funeral," Rebecca said after they exchanged cautious greetings. "Back row, black dress, veil. I left before the service ended. I couldn't bring myself to approach you then." Lydia remembered. She had seen a solitary figure slip out of the church, but she had been too lost in her own grief to wonder who it was. Now, the memory came rushing back with perfect clarity. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Lydia asked, her voice tinged with anger. Rebecca sighed, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. "Daniel and we didn't part on good terms. I hadn't spoken to him in years before he died. And after everything, I didn't think I had the right to interfere in your life. But now—" She pulled a worn manila envelope from her bag and slid it across the table. "Now, I think you deserve the truth." Lydia hesitated before opening the envelope, her hands trembling. Inside were medical records from Boston General Hospital, dated 10 years earlier, about a year before she and Daniel had married. Her eyes scanned the document, her heart pounding. Complete azoospermia. Permanently sterile. No possibility of natural conception. The words seemed to leap off the page, each one a fresh blow. Lydia's mind raced, piecing together what this meant. All those years of fertility treatments, the endless doctor's appointments, the hormone injections, the tears and self-blame. It had all been a cruel charade. Daniel had known he couldn't have children, yet he had let her believe the problem was hers. "I found these after Daniel's death," Rebecca said softly. "I thought about destroying them, but I couldn't. I hoped he might have told you the truth at some point, but when I heard about your sister's claims, I realized he hadn't." Lydia's breath caught in her throat. "You're saying there's no way Celia's baby is Daniel's?" Rebecca nodded. None whatsoever. And if you're willing, I'll testify to that. I'll do whatever it takes to help you. Lydia didn't know what to say. For so long, she had felt like the world was against her, like she was fighting this battle alone. But now, for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Thank you, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Thank you for telling me the truth. Rebecca reached across the table and took Lydia's hand. You've been through enough, Lydia. It's time someone stood up for you. That night, for the first time in weeks, Lydia slept soundly. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let Celia or her parents take another piece of her life. She was going to fight, and with Rebecca by her side, she finally believed she could win. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Lydia arrived early, sitting in the defendant's chair while her lawyer, Richard Dempsey, calmly prepared his notes. She couldn't help but feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, their whispers and glances cutting through her like a knife. At the front of the courtroom, Celia sat with her baby, Daniel's supposed son, cradled in her arms. She had dressed for the occasion, wearing a demure black dress and minimal makeup, her expression perfectly curated to radiate sorrow. Margaret and George flanked her like loyal guards, their faces grim with determination. Lydia glanced at them and felt a pang of anger that burned hotter than any sadness she'd felt since this nightmare began. They weren't here for justice. They were here to ensure Celia won. When the judge entered, the murmurs stopped and the proceedings began. Celia's lawyer spoke first, weaving a tale of love, loss, and betrayal that made Lydia's stomach churn. He painted Celia as a grieving woman who had been unfairly cast aside by her sister, a woman simply fighting for what was right for her child. Celia took the stand next, and Lydia could barely stomach her performance. Tears glistened in her eyes as she spoke about her great love with Daniel, how they had been planning a future together before the tragic accident took him away. All I want, she said, her voice breaking, is what's fair for my son. He deserves his father's legacy. He deserves to know that he mattered to Daniel. Her crocodile tears fell, and Lydia had to fight the urge to stand up and shout the truth. But she didn't. She waited, letting Celia dig her own grave. When Celia finished her testimony, the judge turned to Richard. Does the defense wish to respond? Richard stood, his calm demeanor unshaken by Celia's theatrics. Your Honor, the defense would like to submit evidence that directly refutes Miss Thompson's claims. He approached the bench, handing over the envelope of medical records. The judge reviewed the documents, her expression unreadable as she scanned the pages. Your Honor, Richard continued, these records, obtained from Boston General Hospital, prove that Daniel Wilson was medically diagnosed with complete azoospermia, rendering him sterile and unable to conceive children naturally. Furthermore, we request a DNA test to confirm the paternity of Miss Thompson's child. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Celia's lawyer jumped to his feet, objecting to the submission of the records. Your Honor, these documents could have been fabricated. The chain of custody is questionable, and there's no way to verify their authenticity. Richard remained composed. We anticipated this objection, Your Honor, and we have a witness who can verify the authenticity of these records. The defense calls Rebecca Monroe, Daniel Wilson's biological mother, to the stand. Lydia watched as Rebecca stood, her presence commanding attention. Celia's face turned ashen, and for the first time, Lydia saw cracks in her sister's carefully constructed facade. Rebecca testified with unwavering confidence, confirming the legitimacy of the medical records and explaining the circumstances under which Daniel had received his diagnosis. When Richard requested a DNA test, Celia's composure crumbled completely. That's impossible, she shrieked, clutching the baby tighter. Daniel was an orphan, and his body was cremated. There's no one to test against. Rebecca's voice was calm but firm. I am Daniel's mother. A DNA test can determine whether this child is my grandson. The judge nodded, ordering a DNA test and adjourning the hearing until the results were available. Celia stumbled back to her seat, her face pale and her hands trembling. Lydia watched her sister unravel and felt the faintest flicker of hope. 2 weeks later, the courtroom reconvened, and the atmosphere was tense. Lydia sat quietly, her heart pounding as the judge opened the envelope containing the DNA results. The silence was deafening as everyone waited. The results conclusively show, the judge announced, her voice clear and firm, that there is no genetic relationship between the minor child and Mrs. Rebecca Monroe. Therefore, it can be concluded that Daniel Wilson was not the father of this child. A collective gasp filled the room. Celia's face crumpled as tears streamed down her cheeks, her earlier confidence completely shattered. "Miss Thompson," the judge continued, her tone sharp, "you have committed a gross act of deception against this court and your own family. Your claim to Mr. Wilson's estate is dismissed with prejudice. You are fortunate that Mrs. Parker has not pressed criminal charges for attempted fraud." Celia broke down, sobbing as Margaret and George rushed to console her. But even they seemed shaken by the revelation, their faces pale and their movements hesitant. Lydia watched them with a mix of satisfaction and sadness, knowing this was the final nail in the coffin of her family ties. As she walked out of the courtroom, Rebecca by her side, Lydia felt something she hadn't felt in months: freedom. She had won. Not just the case, but her life back. Celia could no longer hold her hostage with her lies, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lydia saw a path forward. A path without Celia, without her parents, without the shadow of Daniel's betrayal. She didn't look back. Walking out of that courtroom should have felt like victory, but for Lydia, it was bittersweet. She had won the case, proven Celia's lies, and reclaimed what Daniel had left her. But at what cost? The people she thought were her family had shown their true colors, and there was no going back to how things were. Rebecca walked beside her, silent but steady, a quiet anchor in the storm Lydia was still navigating. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, and microphones thrust forward as questions were shouted. Lydia kept her head high, refusing to engage. Rebecca gently guided her through the crowd, shielding her as best she could. When they reached Lydia's car, she turned to Rebecca. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Rebecca smiled softly. "You don't have to thank me, Lydia. You deserve the truth. And you deserve to win." Lydia drove home in silence, the weight of everything hitting her all at once. She had spent so many weeks fighting, against Celia, her parents, even her own doubts, that she hadn't stopped to process what came next. That evening, her phone buzzed with messages from George and Margaret. "Lydia, we need to talk. We didn't know Celia was lying. Please, let's fix this as a family. We're sorry. Don't cut us off." She stared at the messages, her anger simmering beneath the surface. Sorry? They were sorry now, after siding with Celia, defending her lies, and pressuring Lydia to give up everything Daniel had left her. The audacity made her laugh, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed in her empty house. She didn't reply. Instead, she opened her banking app and confirmed that the monthly transfers she had been sending to her parents were still canceled. Let them lean on Celia now, she thought. She was done playing the role of the dutiful daughter, always giving and never receiving. The following week, Margaret showed up at Lydia's doorstep. She looked older, her usual polished appearance replaced by something frazzled and desperate. Lydia hesitated before opening the door, unsure if she was ready for this confrontation. "Lydia, please," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" Lydia asked, crossing her arms. "That you knew about Celia and Daniel and said nothing? That you defended her lies in court? That you took her side over mine?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "We didn't know she was lying about the baby. We thought," she trailed off, shaking her head, "we thought we were doing what was best for the family." "The family," Lydia repeated bitterly. "Is that what you call throwing me under the bus? Supporting the sister who betrayed me? Taking her word over mine?" "Lydia, you don't understand." "No," Lydia interrupted, her voice firm. "I do understand. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. I'm done, Mom. Done with you, with Dad, and with Celia. You don't get to come back now and ask for forgiveness because it's convenient." Margaret reached out, but Lydia stepped back. "Please," Margaret whispered. "We're struggling without your help. Celia can't." "Celia can't what?" Lydia snapped. Manipulate her way out of this one? Lie her way into another inheritance? That's not my problem. With that, Lydia closed the door, shutting out her mother's pleas. She leaned against the door for a moment, her heart racing, but she didn't cry. She had shed enough tears over her family. Lydia's focus shifted to moving forward. She started by packing up Daniel's belongings, deciding it was time to let go of the past. Rebecca came over to help, her presence both comforting and steadying. They worked in silence at first, sorting through clothes, books, and keepsakes. Then Rebecca began sharing stories about Daniel as a boy. How he used to collect rocks, how he once built a treehouse that collapsed the moment he climbed into it. For the first time, Lydia felt like she was seeing a side of Daniel she hadn't known, a version of him untouched by lies or betrayal. It helped, in a strange way, to know that he hadn't always been the man who deceived her. "Do you want to keep any of this?" Rebecca asked, holding up an old jacket of Daniel's. Lydia shook her head. "No, I think it's time to let it all go." They donated most of the items to charity, keeping only a few sentimental pieces that Lydia stored in the attic. When they finished, Rebecca hesitated, her hands folded in her lap. "There's something I've been meaning to say," she began. "That apartment downtown, the one Daniel left you. If it's too much of a reminder, I'd be happy to take it off your hands, but only if you're sure." Lydia smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. "You've already given me more than I can ever repay, Rebecca. It's yours." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears as Lydia handed her the keys. "I never thought I'd have a daughter," Rebecca said, her voice trembling, "but I think I might have found one in you." Lydia hugged her tightly, feeling the sting of tears in her own eyes. It wasn't the family she had started with, but maybe it was the one she was meant to have all along. Cutting ties with her parents and Celia wasn't easy, but Lydia knew it was necessary. She blocked their numbers, ignored their emails, and refused to engage with their attempts to reach her through mutual acquaintances. For the first time in her life, she chose herself. It was a strange kind of freedom, bittersweet but empowering. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was starting to live. And that, she realized, was the best revenge of all. In the weeks that followed, Lydia began to reclaim her life. It wasn't easy. Healing after betrayal felt like learning to breathe underwater. Unnatural, slow, and suffocating at times. But she was determined to try, one small step at a time. The first step was returning to work. Lydia had always loved her job in marketing, but in the months since Daniel's death, it had become a shadow of what it once was. Every project, every deadline had felt meaningless. Now, with the court case behind her, she found herself eager to dive back in. Her boss, Laura, welcomed her return with open arms. "We've missed you, Lydia," she said during Lydia's first day back. "But more importantly, how are you doing?" Lydia hesitated. For months, she had deflected questions like that, brushing them off with rehearsed responses. But something about Laura's genuine concern made her pause. "I'm getting there," she admitted. "It's been hard, but I think I'm ready to move forward." Laura nodded. "Take your time. Your work will always be here, but your peace of mind is what matters most." Those words stuck with Lydia as she settled back into her role. She wasn't just working to stay busy anymore. She was rediscovering her passion for the creative process. She found joy in brainstorming campaigns, collaborating with her team, and watching ideas come to life. Slowly but surely, she started to feel like herself again. Outside of work, Lydia made an effort to reconnect with the world. She joined a local hiking club, something she had always wanted to do but had never found the time for. The first outing was nerve-wracking. She felt like an outsider among the group of seasoned hikers, but by the end of the trail, she realized how much she had missed being surrounded by nature. It became a weekly ritual. Each Saturday morning, Lydia would lace up her boots and join the group, breathing in the crisp air and feeling her body grow stronger with every step. The hikes weren't just about physical exercise. They were about grounding herself, finding peace in the rhythm of her own footsteps. Rebecca quickly became a cornerstone in Lydia's life. The woman who had once been a stranger now felt like family. They started having weekly dinners, a quiet tradition that became one of Lydia's favorite parts of her new routine. During one dinner, Rebecca brought a photo album filled with pictures of Daniel as a child. Lydia hesitated before opening it, unsure if she was ready to face those memories. But as Rebecca flipped through the pages, narrating stories of Daniel's childhood misadventures, Lydia found herself smiling. "I used to think he was fearless," Rebecca said, pointing to a photo of a young Daniel climbing a tree. "But the truth is, he was just really good at pretending. He was scared of heights. He only climbed that tree because he didn't want the other boys to call him a coward." Lydia laughed softly. "That sounds like him. He always put on a brave face, no matter what." Rebecca reached across the table, squeezing Lydia's hand. "He wasn't perfect, Lydia. None of us are. But the good memories, they're still worth holding on to." Those words stayed with Lydia. She realized she didn't have to erase Daniel from her life to move forward. The betrayal didn't negate the moments of happiness they had shared, and letting go of the pain didn't mean forgetting him entirely. One of the biggest steps Lydia took was planning her first solo vacation. It was something she and Daniel had always talked about but never got around to doing. Now, it felt like the right time. She chose Ireland, drawn to its lush landscapes and storied history. As she researched flights and accommodations, she felt a flicker of excitement she hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't just about the destination. It was about proving to herself that she could do this, that she could take control of her life and create new memories. Packing away Daniel's remaining belongings was one of the hardest tasks Lydia faced, but Rebecca was there to help. Together, they sorted through the items, deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what to store. Lydia found herself lingering over certain objects: a watch Daniel had worn every day, a book he had marked with his handwritten notes. "Do you think it's strange to hold on to some of these things?" she asked Rebecca. "Not at all," Rebecca said gently. "They're a part of your story. It's okay to keep the pieces that matter." They donated the bulk of Daniel's clothes to charity, packed away his books, and left only a few cherished items on display. The process was painful, but it also felt like a release. By the time they finished, Lydia felt lighter, as though she had shed a layer of grief she had been carrying for too long. For the first time in months, Lydia looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone she barely recognized. Not the broken woman who had stumbled through her husband's death and her family's betrayal, but someone stronger, someone who had survived. She wasn't fully healed, she knew that, but she was healing, and for the first time, she felt hopeful about what lay ahead. Lydia had lost so much, but she had also gained something unexpected, herself, and that, she realized, was worth fighting for. Lydia's life after the courtroom victory felt like an open field, uncertain but filled with possibility. The ties she had severed with her parents and sister left a hollow ache, but it was an emptiness she had chosen. For too long, she had given parts of herself to people who didn't value her, and now, for the first time, she was reclaiming those pieces. Rebecca became her newfound family. They had started as strangers, but their bond deepened with every shared dinner, every story about Daniel, and every quiet moment of mutual understanding. Lydia offered Rebecca the downtown apartment Daniel had left her, a place Lydia never wanted to set foot in again. "Are you sure?" Rebecca asked when Lydia handed her the keys. "Absolutely," Lydia said with a faint smile. "You've given me so much, your support, the truth about Daniel. Let me give something back." Rebecca's eyes welled with tears as she accepted the keys. "I never thought I'd have a daughter," she whispered. "But it feels like I do now." That sentiment lingered with Lydia, warming the cold spaces left by her family's betrayal. Rebecca wasn't just an ally or a lifeline. She was a reminder that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. The path forward wasn't without its challenges. Lydia spent weeks reclaiming her space and her sense of self. Packing away Daniel's belongings had been difficult, but it was also cathartic. Rebecca had helped her sort through every item, sharing stories about Daniel's childhood that gave Lydia a glimpse into the man he had been before the lies. "I used to think he was fearless," Rebecca said one afternoon as they boxed up his books. "But the truth is, he was just stubborn. He never wanted to let anyone see his weaknesses." Lydia laughed softly, running her fingers over the cover of one of Daniel's old novels. "That sounds about right. He was always trying to be the strong one. I just wish he'd trusted me enough to show me the cracks. Rebecca reached over and placed a hand on Lydia's. You can love someone and still not know all of them. But that doesn't make the love any less real. Those words stayed with Lydia as she began piecing her life back together. She wasn't erasing Daniel from her story. She was simply rewriting her role in it. One of the biggest steps Lydia took was planning her first solo vacation. It was something she and Daniel had always talked about, but life had always gotten in the way. Now, it felt like the right time to follow through. She chose Ireland, drawn to its rolling green hills and ancient castles. As she booked flights and accommodations, she felt a flicker of excitement she hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't just about the destination. It was about proving to herself that she could move forward, that her life didn't have to end where Daniel's had. The day of her flight, Lydia stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her scarf. The woman staring back at her was unfamiliar, but in the best way. Gone was the shadow of grief that had dulled her eyes for so long. In its place was someone stronger, someone who had survived betrayal and heartbreak and come out the other side. Back home, Lydia's phone continued to buzz with messages from her parents and Celia, but she ignored them. She had blocked their numbers, but they found ways to contact her through mutual friends, distant relatives, and even anonymous emails. Each plea was more desperate than the last. We didn't know Celia was lying. We just want to fix things. Please don't cut us off. Lydia didn't respond. She had given them enough chances, enough of herself. They had made their choices, and now she was making hers. One day, she received a letter from Celia. The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic. Lydia, I've changed. I'm so sorry for everything I've done. Please don't punish the baby for my mistakes. I need help. Please. Lydia read the letter twice, then placed it in the shredder. Celia's apologies might have been genuine, but they didn't erase the pain she had caused. Lydia wasn't interested in rebuilding a bridge that had been burned to ash. Rebecca, on the other hand, became a source of joy and stability in Lydia's life. Their weekly dinners turned into a tradition Lydia looked forward to, a chance to share stories and laughter without the weight of betrayal looming over them. I never thought I'd find family again, Lydia admitted one evening as they sat on Rebecca's balcony, sipping tea. Rebecca smiled. Family isn't always about blood. Sometimes, it's about the people who show up when you need them most. Months later, as Lydia stood at the top of a cliff in Ireland, the wind whipping through her hair, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The pain, the anger, the heartbreak. They weren't gone, but they no longer defined her. She had built a new life, a new sense of self, and she wasn't looking back. When she returned home, she found herself joining more activities, a book club, a yoga class, even a pottery workshop. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, creating a life that felt authentically hers. Lydia's story hadn't turned out the way she had planned, but as she reflected on everything she had endured, she realized something important. This was her story now, and she had the power to shape it. She had lost so much, but in the process, she had found something she hadn't even realized she was searching for, herself.